A wooden pole stands at the center of a frozen marketplace. 12 feet of cottonwood sunk deep into the earth, worn smooth where ropes had been tied and untied for years. Snow drifts past it sideways. A crowd has gathered the way crowds gather when laughter is the safest place to stand. Chained to the pole is a woman in a ruined crimson dress. Around her neck hangs a wooden sign painted black and crooked. The words on it are not the kind a town puts in writing unless it has already decided to look the other way. She does not lift her head. At her boots, half hidden beneath the wooden platform, something moves. A starving stray, one torn ear, patient eyes. Patient. The woman crouches despite the chains. From her pocket she draws 3 crumbs of stale bread, the last thing in the world she owns. She slides them across the slush. Far down the north road, 2 riders are coming into town. The wind off the Bitterroot Range came down through Silver Pine Hollow like something that had a grudge. It pushed snow sideways along the false fronts of the saloons. It worried at the brim of every hat in the marketplace. It carried the smell of horse sweat and cheap tobacco and old leather, and something underneath all of it that was harder to name. Cruelty, maybe. The way a town smells when it has decided to look the other way. The marketplace stood at the center of everything. Wagons came in, wagons went out, cattle bawled in the holding pens by the freight scale. 2 miners argued over a card game in front of the assay office. A circuit preacher stood near the well with a Bible held up like a lantern warning sinners about a hellfire none of them seemed afraid of. At the center of it all stood a pole, 12 feet of cottonwood, sunk deep into the frozen earth, worn smooth at the top where ropes had been tied and untied for years. It was the kind of pole towns built for hangings before they got around to building proper gallows. Now it stood between the seed store and the livery, and the town used it for something quieter than killing. They used it for shame. A woman was chained to it. Her name was Lila Whitmore. She was 22 years old. She had come west from Boston in September. She had stepped off the stagecoach in October with a carpet bag in her hand and a folded letter in her pocket and a hope in her chest the size of a small bird. By the second week of November, she was chained to a pole with a sign hung around her neck. The sign was nailed to a board. The board hung from a length of cord that bit into the skin where her collarbones showed through her dress. The words had been painted in black, hasty, and crooked by a man who had not bothered to space them properly. Free. Even beggars refused her. That was what the town saw when they looked at her. What the town did not see was this: that she had once been the daughter of a tailor on Charles Street, that she had once helped her mother starch the lace on christening gowns for women whose names were in the Boston Social Register, that her father had read aloud to her every Sunday evening from a book of Robert Burns until the year the typhoid came down through their neighborhood and took both her parents in a single week. She had been 17. After that, she had worked. She had worked as an assistant teacher in a private school in Beacon Hill. 5 years. 5 years of patient mornings teaching small daughters of senators and shipping merchants how to recite their Wordsworth. 5 years of saving every coin. 5 years of sleeping in a narrow attic above a kitchen that smelled of boiled cabbage. And then, the advertisement. It had appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript in August. A widower in Montana Territory, a cattle rancher of good Christian character, late 30s, lonely, seeking a wife of education and gentle disposition, promising a home, promising a partnership, promising kindness. His letters had come weekly, 3 of them, each one written in a careful copperplate hand, each one describing a cabin she could almost see. Pine floors, a piano in the parlor, a wide porch facing a meadow where deer came down in the mornings. She had believed the letters. Because what else does a woman alone in the world believe but the words of a man who takes the time to write to her? She had spent the last of her savings on a stagecoach ticket. She had packed her mother's small silver hairbrush and her father's copy of Burns. She had pinned her grandmother's cameo at her throat and stepped onto the platform at the Boston and Albany Railroad Station in a deep crimson traveling dress with black lace at the cuffs. By the time she understood what kind of man had written those letters, it was already too late. Now she stood at the pole. The crimson dress had gone the color of old smoke. One sleeve was torn at the shoulder where a hand had dragged her. The cameo at her throat was gone. The iron at her wrists had rubbed the skin to raw red rings. Her hair had been cut crookedly on one side with a kitchen knife, as if to make her ugly on purpose. She kept her head down, not because she was broken, because she could not bear to see one more face laughing. A ranch hand passing on his way to the saloon flicked the core of an apple at her boots. Still breathing, huh? The man behind him spat tobacco juice into the slush. Should have let November take her. Save the town the trouble. The crowd around them laughed the way crowds laugh when laughter is the safest place to stand. The wind picked up again. The cord around her neck swung. The sign rattled against her chest. Free. Even beggars refused her. She closed her eyes. She thought of the letter in her pocket. The third one. The last one. She had kept it folded next to her heart for the whole stagecoach journey from Helena. It had said, I will be waiting on the platform with a blue ribbon tied to my coat, so you will know me. I will treat you with the gentleness you deserve. I have prayed for you every night. The man waiting on the platform had worn a blue ribbon. That had been the first lie. He had been young, too young, 25 maybe, sharp at the jaw, pretty in a way that horses are pretty before they kick you. His name was not the name in the letters. His name was Royce Pell. His father was Thaddeus Pell, who owned more cattle and more men and more silver than any other landowner west of the Missouri Breaks. She had figured out the rest piece by piece over the 8 days she had spent at the Pell Ranch. She had figured out that the letters had been written by Royce to lure her, the same way they had lured 5 women before her. She had figured out that the previous 5 women were gone. She had figured out where one of them had gone on the night of the 7th day when she had been carrying a tray of biscuits across the porch and a man in a stagecoach driver's coat had pulled her behind the smokehouse and whispered that the woman with him was named Adelaide, that he was sorry that he was trying to help her get out, and would Lila come with them, would she please come? And then, the shot. From the corner of the stable, Royce Pell with a Colt revolver still smoking, the driver dead in the dirt, Adelaide screaming behind him. Adelaide, who Lila had not known by name on that night, only by the look of a woman who had been at the Pell Ranch too long. Lila would learn the name later, much later, in a kitchen, from an old woman with a velvet pouch. Royce wiping the barrel calm as a man wiping rain off a window. Now then, he had said, look what she did. It had taken less than an hour. The sheriff had come. The sheriff was a Pell man. The story was already written. The mail-order girl from Boston, caught with the stage driver, a jealous fit, a pulled trigger, a dead man. Lila had screamed it was a lie. The sheriff had not even looked at her. They could not hang her. That much she had heard them arguing through the wall, because the headmaster at the Beacon Hill School had recommended her. Because there were people in Boston who knew her name. Because if she vanished, there would be letters and questions and federal interest, and Thaddeus Pell did not like federal interest. So they had brought her here, to the pole, to die slowly in a way that looked like the town's idea, not theirs. The wind cut harder, her teeth chattered. She tried to keep them still by pressing her tongue against the roof of her mouth. She did not cry. She had not cried in 2 days. Crying took more water than her body could afford. Then she felt something brush her boot. She looked down. A dog had crawled out from under the wooden platform, a small thing, mostly ribs. One ear was torn at the tip. Its fur was the color of dirty straw. Its eyes were the patient eyes of an animal that has learned not to expect anything. It looked up at her. She looked back. And something inside her, something that had been very quiet for 2 days, opened the smallest crack. She crouched down. The chains pulled hard at her wrists. The iron edges cut deeper. She did not flinch. From the pocket of her ruined dress, she drew out what she had left. 3 crumbs of stale bread. An old churchwoman had pressed them into her hand yesterday before the market keeper had shouted her off. She had been saving them, not for hunger, for company. She slid them across the slush to the dog. The dog ate them. She watched it eat. She thought, there, that was something. That was one good thing in the world today. And then she closed her eyes again. She did not see the rider come into town. He came from the North Road. Two riders, in fact. The first one rode a tall, dark stallion that had seen a lot of winners. The second one rode behind him on a smaller buckskin with a pack mule tied off behind. Both men wore long wool coats the color of bark. Both men wore wide hats pulled low. Both men carried rifles in saddle scabbards and revolvers low at the hip. The older one was Holden Briggs, 35 years old, 6 feet 4. Shoulders built by 12 years of mountain ranch work and 4 years before that of carrying a Union infantry pack through Tennessee. His hair was dark brown going to iron at the temples. His beard was 3 days unshaven. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight. There was a scar at the corner of his mouth shaped like a fishhook. He had not smiled in 3 years. The younger one was Tobias Briggs, 32, 6 feet 2, leaner than his brother, quieter than his brother, which was saying something. He had ridden with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in the Western Territories after the war, and he carried that in the way he sat a saddle. Eyes never still, hands never far from a holster. Conversation lowered when the brothers crossed the marketplace. A gambler outside the saloon muttered something to the man next to him. Thought the Briggs boys didn't come down till spring. Out of coffee, maybe. Out of something. The brothers rode through the noise without looking at any of it. They tied their horses outside the supply store. They stamped snow off their boots on the wooden step. They went inside. They did not see the pole. Not yet. Holden picked up flour, salt pork, lamp oil, a new coffee mill because the old one had finally cracked through the handle. Tobias picked up a box of cartridges for the Sharps rifle. He paid in silver. He did not say much. The storekeeper did not say much either. He had been one of the men who had not come to the Briggs cabin during the fever, and he had never quite been able to look Holden in the eye since. It was when they came out when Holden was loading the supply sack into the wagon that he had tied behind the buckskin that he heard the laughter. He heard it the way a hunter hears the wrong sound in the woods. It was not ordinary laughter. It was the kind of laughter a crowd makes when there is something weak in the middle of it. He turned his head. He saw the pole. He saw the woman chained to it. He stopped moving. Tobias glanced at him, then followed his look, then was very still in a different way. Easy, Tobias said, low, just for his brother. Holden did not answer. He was looking at her hands. She was crouched down, despite the chains, sliding something across the slush. To a dog. The dog ate from her fingers. A small wind moved her ruined hair. 3 winters ago, Lottie had sat on the porch of the ranch house, feeding a one-eyed barn cat in exactly that way. She had been 6 years old. She had been wearing the blue ribbon her mother had tied in her hair that morning. She had said, "Daddy, he needs it more than I do." Lottie had been the last of his to go. After Mary. After the long night with the lamp burning and the doctor not coming because the doctor was scared too. Holden Briggs had not been a man who cried easily before that week. He had not been a man who cried easily after it either. But something had broken in him on the morning he had carried his daughter wrapped in her mother's quilt out into the yard and stood there in the snow, not knowing where to put her. For 3 years, he had been a quiet thing on a mountain. For 3 years, he had thought he had run out of room inside himself for any other person. He stood in the slush of the marketplace at Silver Pine Hollow on a November afternoon in 1875. He watched a half-starved woman feed a half-starved dog, and he discovered that he had been wrong about himself. The room inside him was not gone. It was just locked, and someone had just put a key in it without asking. "Holden," Tobias said. Holden did not move. "Holden, we came down for coffee." "We did." "That ain't our business." "No. That sign says she's free." You walk over there, the whole town watches." "I know." A long pause. The wind moved between them. Tobias sighed, the kind of sigh he had been giving his older brother for 3 years. The sigh of a man who had carried someone uphill and was about to have to do it again. "You walk over there," Tobias said quieter. "I'm walking with you." Holden looked at him. Then he started across the marketplace. The market keeper was a man named Boyd Crenshaw. Wide, soft around the middle. Eyes that had once been kind and were now hidden behind a tired sort of fear. He sat on a wooden crate near the pole drinking coffee out of a tin cup. When he saw Holden coming, he tried to stand up too fast and spilled the coffee down his coat. "Mr. Briggs," he said. Holden walked past him. He stopped a few feet from the pole. Lila did not look up. She had heard boots. She had learned in 8 days at the Pell Ranch and 2 days at this pole to keep her eyes down when boots came close. Boots were the part of a man that hit you. Faces only made it worse. "Ma'am," Holden said. His voice was low, quieter than the wind. She did not look up. "Ma'am, you hurt." She did not answer. Because answers cost something. Because the last time a man had asked her a soft question, it had been Royce Pell holding a coffee cup on the porch of his ranch on her first morning there, and the kindness in his voice had been the first warning she had been too tired to hear. Holden read the silence. He looked at the sign on her chest. Free. Even beggars refused her. He read it twice, slowly, like a man checking arithmetic. "Crenshaw," he said. "Yes, sir." "Who put her here?" "Sheriff brought her in 2 days back." "On what charge?" Boyd Crenshaw swallowed. "Killing, they say. A stage driver out at the Pell place. And she's here, not in the jail." They didn't want the cost of feeding her Mr. Briggs, the sheriff said. Just to let the town decide. Decide what? Boyd did not answer. He did not have to. Holden looked down at Lila Whitmore again. He saw the iron at her wrists. He saw the dried blood there. He saw the way the wind moved the dress against her thin shoulders. He saw the small dog at her boots, looking up at him now with a kind of cautious calculation, the way a dog looks at the next man who might decide its day. "Get her loose," Holden said. Boyd Crenshaw made a small wet noise in his throat. "Mr. Briggs, the sheriff, you got a key?" "I." "Crenshaw." Boyd looked everywhere except at Holden. He looked at the pole. He looked at Tobias, who had drifted around behind him without seeming to walk. He looked at the saloon where 2 of the Pell men were already standing in the doorway watching. "Mr. Briggs, please, if I—" Holden did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He reached inside his coat. He brought out a folded leather purse. He tipped it open with his thumb and let 4 silver dollars drop into Boyd Crenshaw's palm. "For the trouble," Holden said, "and the chain." Then he drew the knife from his belt. It was an old knife. The handle was wrapped in rawhide gone dark with use. The blade was 8 inches of forged steel that Holden had sharpened the night before by lamplight because he had needed something to do with his hands. He bent down. The crowd had gone quiet. The 2 Pell men in the saloon doorway moved 1 step out, then stopped. Because Tobias had turned his body slow casual, and the long line of his coat had fallen open just enough to show the revolver on his hip. He was looking right at them. Not threatening, just looking. The way a man looks at a clock when he wants to remind it that he knows what time it is. The Pell men did not take a second step. Holden cut the cord at the back of the pole. The chain dropped heavy into the slush. The iron at her wrist was still locked, but the lead was free. The sign on her chest hung loose. He cut that cord too. He let the sign fall face down into the snow. Lila looked up for the first time. She did not look at him directly. She looked at his hands, at the knife, at the calluses across the knuckles, at the long, thin scar that ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist. A working man's hands. Not a Royce Pell hand. Royce Pell had hands like a piano player. These were the other kind. She finally lifted her eyes to his face. He had a beard going to gray at the chin. He had whiskey-colored eyes. He had a hook-shaped scar at the corner of his mouth. He had no expression at all except that something behind his eyes was holding very still in a way she did not understand. "Can you stand?" he asked her. She tried, her knees gave. He caught her arm before she went down. His grip was as gentle as a man cradling a bird. She flinched anyway. Not at him, at the memory of every other hand. He felt the flinch travel up her arm and into her shoulder, and he went very still the way a person goes still around a deer at the edge of a clearing. He did not let go, but he did not hold tighter either. "All right," he said, quiet, almost to himself. All right. He took off his coat, the big wool one, the one his wife had patched at the elbows the winter before she died, and he had not let anyone touch since. He set it across her shoulders. The weight of it nearly took her down again. "Wagon's right there," he said. "Easy step, one at a time." She tried. The town watched. Nobody laughed now. The drunken man with the apple core had drifted back into the saloon. The card players had folded their hands. The circuit preacher had stopped his sermon halfway through a verse about Lazarus. A woman in a feed store apron stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, and she would later that night in her own kitchen weep without quite knowing why. The little dog limped after Lila across the slush. It kept close to her boots. It had decided something about her in the last 10 minutes that was simpler than anything human beings ever decide. When she could not make it up the wagon step on her own, Holden lifted her. He lifted her the way you lift a sister or a child you are trying not to wake. He set her on the bench. He picked up the dog and set it in her lap. The dog laid its head down on her hand. For the first time in 11 days, something in her chest stopped clenching. "You bought yourself a problem, Briggs," somebody muttered from the boardwalk. Holden did not look. He climbed up beside her. He took the reins. He clucked once at the horse. The wagon rolled. Behind it, Tobias mounted his buckskin without taking his eyes off the saloon. He rode out backward for the first 30 yards. Then he turned his horse and caught up to his brother. The wooden pole stood alone in the marketplace. The sign lay face down in the slush where Holden had let it drop. A dog with one torn ear had ridden off in the lap of the woman who had given it bread. Snow began to come down again across Silver Pine Hollow. It came down hard enough by sunset to bury the sign completely. By morning, no one would be able to tell where it had fallen. Some people in town would later say that was the moment something began to turn in Silver Pine Hollow, although none of them would have been able to say what. Lila did not speak for the first hour of the ride. The road wound up out of the valley. Pines closed in on both sides. The wind moved through the high branches like a hand running over the strings of an instrument that did not want to be played. The wagon wheels groaned in the frozen ruts. The mule on the lead rope huffed steam into the cold air. She kept the coat tight around her shoulders. She kept her hands flat on the dog. She kept her eyes on the horse's rump in front of her because looking sideways at the man beside her felt dangerous in a way she could not name. Not because she thought he would hurt her, but because if she looked at him too long, she might start to hope again. And hope had cost her everything she had. Holden did not look at her either. He looked at the road. He sat with his elbows on his knees and the reins loose in his hands, the way men sit who have driven wagons over the same road for 1,000 trips. Tobias rode out ahead 20 yards. He scanned the trees. He scanned the ridges. He scanned the road behind. He did not trust the silence of the woods. He had not trusted it since the war. Finally, Lila spoke. Her voice came out as a scrape. "You should leave me at the next bend." "No, ma'am." "They will come." "They might." "Then leave me at the bend." He did not look at her. He did not slow the horse. "Ma'am," he said, "I lost everything I had once because folks were too scared to help. I ain't doing that again." That was all. She did not answer. She tried not to feel the small breaking thing in her chest. She tried not to feel anything at all because feeling was a luxury for women who had a roof. She lost that fight. A tear ran down her face, then another. She did not wipe them away. She did not let him see her face. She just bent her head down over the dog and let the tears fall into its fur, and the dog who had been sleeping made a small contented noise as if it understood. They reached the ranch as the last of the daylight was draining off the western ridges. The Briggs place sat in a high bowl of land at the foot of the Bitterroots, a barn that listed slightly to the west, a corral with rails patched in 3 places, a ranch house of squared pine logs, 2 stories with a porch that needed a new step. No smoke came from the chimney. The windows looked at nothing. Lila looked at the house and felt her throat close. Because it was beautiful. Not in any showy way. Beautiful the way a tired person is beautiful when they finally lie down. Tobias unsaddled the horses. Holden climbed down. He came around to her side of the wagon. He held out his hand to help her down. She hesitated. Not because she did not want to touch him, because she did not know what her body remembered anymore. She put her hand in his. She came down off the wagon onto her own feet. The dog jumped down behind her. It stayed at her heel. He led her up the porch. He pushed the door open. He stood aside. He did not enter first. She noticed that. She did not know why she noticed it, only that some part of her understood it had to do with respect. And respect was a word she had stopped expecting from a man's hands. Inside, a cold parlor, a stone fireplace, a rocking chair pulled close to it, bookshelves with the books still in good order, a pair of small boots set neatly by the back door of the kitchen, a child's coat hanging on a hook at child height, 3 years of dust on everything. She understood the moment she saw the boots. She did not say anything. He saw her see them. He did not say anything either. He went into the kitchen. He set down the supply sack. He bent to the stove. He started a fire with hands that had built 10,000 fires. She stood in the doorway. She held the coat around her shoulders. The dog sat at her boot. Tobias came in behind her with the rifle in one hand and the lamp in the other. He looked at her standing there in the wreck of her crimson dress with his brother's coat over her like a blanket on a bird. He looked at the dust on the parlor floor. He looked at his brother kneeling at the stove. He nodded once to no one as if confirming a thought he had been chewing on for half the ride home. Then he set the lamp on the kitchen table. "Coffee," he said. "Then stew. Then we figure out the rest." Holden grunted in agreement. Lila stayed in the doorway. She did not know how to come the rest of the way in. She thought distantly. "I am inside a house. There is a fire being built. There are men in this house, and they have not asked anything of me, and the door is not locked behind me, and I do not know what to do with that." The fire caught in the stove. The room began to fill slowly with the smell of pine smoke and salt pork and coffee. The dog laid down on the kitchen floor and put its head between its paws and closed its eyes for the first time in weeks. After a while, when the stew had begun to warm and Tobias had stepped out to settle the horses, Holden carried a lamp upstairs to show her the room. He stopped at a door at the end of the hallway. He stood with his hand on the latch for what was for him a long time. Then he opened it. Inside was a small bed under a window, a handmade quilt with pink stars on it, a row of small wooden horses on a shelf, a faded blue ribbon hanging on the bedpost, a pair of child's mittens folded on the dresser as if waiting for the morning the child went outside. "You'll sleep here," Holden said. "I can take the barn." "You ain't livestock, ma'am." It was the same tone he had used in the marketplace. Quiet, final, not unkind. He set the lamp down on the dresser. He turned to leave. He paused in the doorway. He did not look back at her. "My girl," he said. Her name was Lottie. She was 6. She would have given her own quilt to a stranger before she let a stranger sleep cold. "So you take her bed tonight and don't apologize for it." He left. His boots went down the stairs. The kitchen door opened. The kitchen door closed. The sound of him crossing the yard to help Tobias with the last of the horses came faintly through the floor. Lila Whitmore stood in the middle of Lottie Briggs' room. She did not move for a long time. She did not touch anything. She did not sit on the bed. She did not even set down the coat. She stood in the lamplight with her hands at her sides, and she let her eyes travel slowly over every object in the room as if she were memorizing it. The ribbon, the mittens, the horses, the quilt with pink stars. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She knelt down on the floor beside the bed. She lowered her forehead to the edge of the quilt. She whispered into the wool, into the dust, into the dark, to a child she had never met. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry to be in your room. I will not move your things. I will only borrow the bed. I will leave by the spring if your father wants me gone. I do not know you, but I think I would have liked you very much." The dog had come up the stairs behind her. It sat in the doorway and watched. After a while, she got up. She unfastened her ruined boots. She set them by the bed exactly the way the child's boots were set by the kitchen door downstairs. She climbed into the bed in her ruined crimson dress because she had nothing else. She pulled the quilt with pink stars up to her chin. The dog jumped onto the foot of the bed and curled there. She closed her eyes. She thought she would lie awake. She was asleep in under a minute. It was the deepest sleep she had slept in 5 years. Downstairs, Holden Briggs sat at the kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee in his hands. He did not drink from it. He just held it. He watched the steam come up off the surface and bend in the lamplight. Tobias came in from the barn. He stamped the snow off his boots. He hung his coat on the peg. He poured himself a cup. He sat down across from his brother. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Tobias said, "She'll bring trouble up this mountain." "I know. Pell ain't a man who lets a thing go." "I know." Tobias took a slow swallow of coffee. "You sure?" he said. Holden looked up at his brother. The hook-shaped scar at the corner of his mouth caught the lamplight. "Tobias, she fed a dog while she was dying." That was all he said. It turned out it was enough. Tobias nodded slowly. He set down his cup. He stretched out his legs under the table. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. Outside, the wind picked up. The snow came down harder. Somewhere out in the timber, a wolf called once and got no answer. In the room at the end of the upstairs hall, a woman slept under a quilt with pink stars, and a dog kept watch from the foot of her bed. Hours later, near midnight, Lila woke for a moment. She did not know why. She lay still and listened. The wind, the fire downstairs settling in the stove, the small breathing of the dog. She got up, quietly, drawn by something she could not name. She crossed to the window of Lottie's room. She drew aside the thin curtain. She looked out into the yard. Snow was falling. The moon was a smear behind cloud. The barn stood dark, and at the edge of the trees by the foot of an old pine someone was moving. A figure, bent low, a spade in his hands, snow on his shoulders. He was digging, quiet, steady, like a man who had done this before. It was Tobias. He was burying something, or unearthing something. From this distance, in this dark, she could not tell which. She watched him for a long minute. She did not breathe. He stopped. He stood up. He wiped the back of his glove across his mouth. He looked just once up at the house, up at the window where she stood. She did not move. She did not know if he saw her. He bent back down to his work. She let the curtain fall. She stood in the dark room. The dog had lifted its head from the foot of the bed and was looking at her. Her heart was loud in her ears. She thought, "I do not know these men. I do not know what is buried under that tree. I do not know what kind of house I have walked into. I do not know if the man who cut my chains today is a man who keeps secrets that could undo me by morning. I do not know any of it. I only know that for the first time in 11 days, no one is hurting me tonight, and that for now has to be enough." She lay back down. She pulled the quilt with the pink stars up to her chin. The dog laid its head back on her foot, outside in the dark under the pine tree. Tobias Briggs kept digging. She woke before dawn. Old habit. In Boston, in the attic above the cabbage-smelling kitchen, she had always woken before the milkman came up Charles Street. In the Pell house, she had always woken before Royce did, because the only safe hour was the hour before he was awake. So her body woke before dawn out of caution. But this morning, the caution did not know what to do with itself. There was no milkman. There was no Royce. There was only a small room with pink stars on a quilt and a dog asleep on her foot, and a window full of pale gray light and snow. She lay very still. She listened. She heard the wind. She heard a horse stamp in the corral. She heard the small, thoughtful pop of pines settling in a cold house. She did not hear footsteps. She did not hear a man's voice raised. She did not hear a door slam. She did not hear anyone hurting anyone, which was its own kind of strange. She sat up slowly. The dog opened one eye. The dog closed it again. The dog had decided at some point in the night that this woman was its assignment, and assignments were not to be disturbed unnecessarily. She put her bare feet on the cold floor. The crimson dress hung on her like an apology. The lace at the cuffs was torn. The hem was crusted with old market mud. She tried to smooth it. She gave up. She crossed to the dresser. There was an oval mirror above it, Lottie's mirror. A child's mirror set at child height so that Lila had to stoop a little to see her own face. She saw a woman she did not recognize. Cheekbones too sharp, lips cracked at one corner, a bruise yellowing along the jaw, hair that had been hacked off on one side and that hung lopsided on the other, eyes that looked as if they had been awake for a year. She touched the glass. She lowered her hand. She thought, I will not cry in this child's room. I will not bring more sad into a house that has already had too much of it. Then she straightened her back, because she had learned somewhere along the way that a straight back was a small private rebellion that nobody could take from her. She went down the stairs. The stairs creaked. She froze on the third one from the bottom, because in her experience, creaking stairs woke men, and waking men was the beginning of a bad morning. A voice came from the kitchen. Stairs do that. It was Holden, calm, not annoyed, like a man telling a guest where the well was. She came the rest of the way down. He was at the stove. He was already dressed. He had a tin coffee pot in one hand and a tin cup in the other. He had not shaved. The hook-shaped scar at the corner of his mouth caught the lamplight again. He set the cup on the table. For you, he said. She did not move. It's coffee, he said. Nothing else. She came to the table. She sat down. She did not pick up the cup. Her hands had started shaking, and she did not want him to see that. He pretended not to see. He sat down across from her with his own cup. He did not look at her face. He looked at the table. The way you look down when you do not want to spook an animal that has just come close enough to drink. After a long minute, she picked up the cup. It was so warm it almost hurt. She took one swallow. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She set the cup down, very carefully, because if she did not set it down carefully, she was going to drop it, and if she dropped it, she was going to apologize, and if she started apologizing, she was going to cry. He watched her hands, not her face, just her hands. You ate yesterday, he said. She did not answer. Day before. She did not answer. Before that. She lifted one shoulder. He nodded once, like a man confirming a roadmap. He got up. He went to the stove. He came back and set a tin plate in front of her. Salt pork, a biscuit, a spoon of preserved peaches he had clearly opened that morning. Slow, he said, or your stomach won't keep it. She ate. She tried to eat slowly. She failed. The dog sat at her feet and waited for the part that would be hers. Tobias came in from the yard while she was still chewing. He brought cold air in with him and the smell of horse and pine. He stamped snow off his boots at the door. He did not look surprised to see her at the table. He nodded at her the way a man nods at a person he has decided to allow. Morning. Morning, she managed. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the window. He drank. She tried not to stare at his hands. Because his hands looked exactly like the hands she had seen last night through the upstairs window, holding a spade, bent low under the pine tree. She looked away. She told herself, eat the biscuit. Do not be the kind of woman who interrogates a man before noon in a house where she has slept for one night. She ate the biscuit. Holden refilled her cup without asking. It was the smallest kind of kindness. It nearly undid her. She set the cup down again. She folded her hands in her lap. She made her voice very quiet. Mr. Briggs? Holden's fine. Holden. Yes. I do not know how to be in a house. That is not. She stopped. She could not find the rest of the sentence. The kitchen waited politely for her to find it. That is not paid for in some other way. She did not look up. She heard Tobias set down his cup. She heard the wind. She heard Holden draw a slow breath in through his nose. Ma'am, he said. Lila. Lila. He said her name the way a man says the name of a town he is trying to find on a map. Carefully, like he wanted to be sure to get there. Lila, you don't pay for it, not with anything. But you don't pay for it. He said it the way he had said "you ain't livestock" the night before. Flat, final, quiet. She nodded because she did not trust her voice, because something in her chest had unhooked itself from somewhere and was sliding around loose and she did not know yet what to do with it. Then he said almost as an afterthought, "Sink leaks, pump freezes about half the mornings. If you want to do something with your hands, do that." It was permission, wrapped in a chore. She understood it perfectly. Something inside her for the first time in 11 days lifted its head. "Yes," she said. She got up, she walked to the sink, she started to work. By the time the first real light came up over the ridge, she had swept the kitchen. She had washed 3 years of dust off the windows above the sink. She had wrung out a rag and lye water and gone over the table. She had set the curtains back on their rod where one of them had come loose. She had not touched the rocking chair in the parlor. She had not touched the bookshelves. She had not touched anything that looked like it might still belong to a woman named Mary. She knew the rules of houses like this without being told. You did not move the dead person's things. You let the living person move them. Or not. Holden came back in from the barn around mid-morning. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. He looked at the windows. He looked at the table. He looked at the curtains. He did not say anything. Then he said very low, more to the room than to her, "Light comes in different now." He walked through to the parlor and did not say anything else. In the parlor, he stood for a long time in front of the fireplace, his back to her, his hat still in his hand. She did not follow him. She knew better. She put the kettle on. That was how the first week passed. She cooked. He hunted. Tobias mended fences. She kneaded bread. He chopped wood. Tobias rode the perimeter. She baked. He hauled water. Tobias watched the road from a high rock above the south meadow with a long brass spyglass. She noticed the spyglass. She did not ask. She noticed a lot of things she did not ask about. She noticed that Tobias kept a Sharps rifle behind the kitchen door and a Henry behind the parlor door, and a Colt revolver in a drawer in the front hall, and a knife sheathed inside his right boot at all times. She noticed that Holden's hands shook a little when he carried in the stove wood. Not from weakness, from holding still too long for 3 years. She noticed that neither brother sat in the rocking chair in the parlor. Ever. The chair belonged to a ghost named Mary. She noticed that the boots by the back door of the kitchen had been polished. Recently. By someone. She did not ask who. On the third day, she stood on a chair to take down the heavy parlor curtains so she could beat the dust out of them in the yard. She had her back to the door. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She heard him not say anything for a long count. She turned around on the chair, slowly holding the curtain. He was standing in the doorway. His hat was off. His mouth had gone in a hard, straight line. She thought, "I have done something wrong. I have moved something I should not have moved. I have walked into the part of the house that is hers." She said, "I." He said, "It's all right." But his voice did not match the words. She climbed down from the chair. She set the curtain over the back of a wooden chair. She kept her hands very still at her sides. He came into the parlor. He stood in the place where the curtain light had used to be dim. He turned in a slow half circle. He looked at the bookshelves. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the rocking chair. He looked at the room the way a man looks at a face he used to know. He swallowed. "Mary," he said. He said it once. That was all. He turned and walked back out to the porch. Lila stood in the parlor with the curtain in her hands and her heart trying to climb up out of her throat. She thought, "I have hurt him. I have hurt him by accident. I have let too much light into a room that he was keeping dark on purpose." She did not know yet that some rooms have to be hurt before they can heal. She would learn. By the second week, she had begun to hum, without knowing she was doing it. It was something her mother used to hum in Boston in the kitchen above Charles Street. She did not even know the words, only the shape of the tune. She hummed it as she rolled out biscuit dough. She hummed it as she stirred the stew. She hummed it as she scrubbed the floor where dust had collected in front of the stove. Out in the yard, Holden was mending the porch step. The hammer paused. He stood there with the hammer in his hand and his head bent. and he did not move for the longest time. Because. Because he had not heard a woman hum in his kitchen in 3 winters. Tobias, walking past with an armload of wood, glanced at him. Tobias did not say anything. He just nodded once to no one in particular, the way he had nodded in the wagon on the way home from town, and he went on into the barn. That night she dreamed of Royce Pell for the first time. She woke up gasping. The dog was already up. The dog had pressed itself against her side. The dog had its ears flat. She sat up in the dark. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She did not make any noise, because in the Pell house noise had been dangerous. She held her breath until the spinning in her head slowed down. She listened. Downstairs. Nothing. The clock on the parlor mantel was the only thing in the house that was speaking. She lay back down. She put her hand on the dog. She thought, "He cannot reach me here. He cannot reach me here." She did not believe it. She had walked across the country once on a promise from a man with a copperplate hand. She had learned the hard way that distance was not the same thing as safety. She lay awake until dawn. Holden saw it in her face at the breakfast table. He did not ask. He went out to the barn. He came back in with the smaller of the 2 revolvers. A Colt pocket, polished, light in the hand. He set it down on the table next to her coffee cup. She stared at it. That is not. It's yours. I have never. I'll teach you." She looked up at him. His eyes were the same color as the coffee in her cup. "I do not want," she said, "I know. I do not want to be that woman." "I know." A pause. "But you ain't the woman from the pole anymore either," he said. "And the woman in between needs to know how to put 2 holes in a fence post." She did not laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved, for the first time in 11 days. Tobias appeared in the kitchen doorway behind his brother. He had clearly been listening from the porch. He said, "Better me than him." Holden glanced at him. Tobias shrugged. "He yells when he teaches. You should see him try to teach a colt." Holden gave him a look. It was the look brothers give each other across kitchens. For 1/2 second, the hook-shaped scar at the corner of Holden's mouth almost did something that on another man would have been a smile. Almost. So Tobias taught her, in the back field. At a fence post they did not need. Behind the barn where the snow was deep and the sound did not carry far. He did not yell. He did not even raise his voice. He stood at her shoulder and he said, "Breathe out. Squeeze, do not pull. Watch the front sight. Trust the front sight. The back sight is a liar." She put 2 holes in the fence post on the 3rd try. He nodded once, the way he nodded at everything. She let the breath out she had not known she was holding. On the 14th day, she went to draw water from the well behind the house. She walked past the old pine tree at the edge of the yard, the one she had watched him digging at from the upstairs window the first night. The snow was packed down around the base of the tree, recently, repeatedly, by a man's boots. She stopped. She looked at the snow. She looked up at the tree. The wind moved the branches above her. She thought, "None of my business." She thought, "None of my business." She walked to the well. She drew water. She walked back. She did not look at the tree on the way back. That night at supper, she put down her spoon. She looked at Tobias. The pine tree at the back of the yard. The kitchen got very quiet. Holden did not look up from his bowl. Tobias did look up, slowly. "What about it? You go out there at night." Tobias did not blink. "Yes." "With a spade." "Yes." "What is under that tree?" A long silence. Holden lifted his head. He looked at his brother, not surprised, the way a man looks at something he has suspected for a while. Tobias looked at his brother right back. Then Tobias looked at Lila. He set down his spoon. "Come on," he said. He stood up. He went to the back door. He took down the lantern. He lit it. "Tobias," Holden said. "She is sitting at this table," Tobias said. "She needs to know." Holden stood up too, slow. The 3 of them walked out into the snow. The pine tree was tall. It had been there longer than the house. Its lowest branches had been trimmed up years ago for the cattle to walk under. At the base of the trunk on the side facing the woods, the snow was tamped down in a circle the size of a small room. Tobias handed Holden the lantern. He knelt down. He brushed away the snow with his glove, then with his bare hand. Then he reached under a flat slab of bark that did not quite belong on the tree, and he pulled. A piece of bark lifted. Behind it was a wooden door the size of a footlocker fitted into the side of the tree where rot had hollowed it years ago. The door had a leather hinge. The leather hinge was new. He pulled the door open. Inside the tree, rifles. 3 of them, wrapped in oilcloth, standing upright, plus a heavy wooden crate at the bottom that even in the lantern light Lila could see was full of cartridge boxes. And a small powder keg. And a canvas roll that when Tobias touched it, clinked the way only one thing clinks. Money. Holden took one step back. The lantern light shook in his hand, not from cold. Tobias. Holden. How long? Since spring. Spring. Since the trapper came through, last May. Ulysses Hatch. You remember him? I remember him. He came up here, asked for water, drank his coffee on the porch. He had been at the Pell Ranch the week before. He had heard a woman crying in the smokehouse at night. He told me he did not stop to look. He said he wished he had. Holden closed his eyes. You have known, he said, since May. I have known. Tobias said that something at the Pell place was going to come up this mountain one day. I did not know it would come up the mountain on the back of a wagon I drove home myself. He looked at Lila when he said it. Not unkindly, just truthfully. She had to grip the side of the tree to stay standing. Because she understood in that moment that she was not the first mail-order bride to walk into Royce Pell's house. And she understood that she was not even the first one Tobias Briggs had been preparing for. He had been getting ready for her for 6 months. He had just not known it would be her. Holden looked at his brother for a long time. Then he stepped forward. He set the lantern down in the snow. He put his hand on the back of his brother's neck. He drew Tobias's forehead against his own. He held it there. Neither man spoke. Lila looked away, because some things, even in their dark, are private. When they stepped apart, Tobias closed the bark door of the tree. He pressed it shut. He patted snow back over the base. It is not paranoia, he said quietly, mostly to her, if they really are coming. Holden nodded. The 3 of them walked back to the house without speaking. The dog walked at her heel through the snow. That night, Lila did not dream of Royce Pell. She dreamed for the first time in many years of her mother humming over biscuit dough in a Boston kitchen. She woke at first light with a wet face and a quiet chest. 2 days later, the Doyles came up the mountain. It was the worst weather of the month. A late November storm had been building for a day and a half. The sky had gone the color of an iron skillet. The wind had been pushing snow at the windows in long, flat sheets since dawn. It was mid-afternoon when Lila saw the rider come up the ridge. She was at the window above the kitchen sink. She had been peeling potatoes. She saw a single horseman pushing through the drifts on a small bay mare. The horse was lathered even in the cold. The man was bent low over the saddle. She called for Holden. He was on the porch already. He had seen the rider half a mile back. The man was Eli Doyle. He had a farm in the valley below. He was a thin man, plain-spoken, with a wife named Hannah, and 4 children, the youngest of whom was a boy named Caleb. 6 years old, the same age Lottie had been. Eli Doyle nearly fell off the horse at the bottom of the porch steps. He could barely speak. His mustache was stiff with ice. My boy, he managed. My Caleb, fever, 4 days. He ain't keeping water down. Hannah said, go anywhere. She said, the Briggs woman. He swayed. They are saying in town that she knows about children. Holden caught him before he went into the snow. For a moment, nobody moved. The Briggs woman. Lila stood in the doorway with a potato in her hand. She had not been called anything other than thief and worse in 3 weeks. The Briggs woman. Eli Doyle looked at her. His eyes were red and exhausted. "Ma'am," he said, "please." She set the potato down on the porch rail. She did not look at Holden when she answered. "Saddle the horses," she said. "Pack the medicines, the willow bark, the mustard, the honey jar, the clean linen from the top of the press." Holden was already moving. Tobias came around the corner of the barn at a run, having heard the rider. "Stay," Lila said to Tobias, sharp, surprising herself. Tobias stopped. He looked at her. He looked at Holden. He understood. "If they come up the mountain while we are gone," he said. She did not answer that. She did not need to. He nodded. Holden and Lila rode out into the storm with Eli Doyle between them. She had never ridden a horse hard in her life. She rode hard now. Holden looked back at her, once surprised at how she sat the saddle, and she said, "Beacon Hill, my headmaster's daughters, their pony. Please keep going." He kept going. The Doyle farmhouse was a cabin and a half. 3 rooms, smoke staining the rafters. A wife at the door with her hair half down and a baby on her hip and the kind of eyes a mother has when she has been awake for 4 nights. The little boy was in the back room, under 3 quilts. His skin was the color of wet paper. His lips were blue at the edges. His breath came shallow and quick. Lila put down her bag. She put her hand on the boy's forehead. She thought, "He is dying." She did not say it aloud. She turned to Hannah Doyle. She said, "Bring me cold water. Bring me clean cloths. Bring me your sharpest knife. Bring me a bowl. Boil water on the stove. Build the fire up only halfway. Do not overheat this room." Hannah Doyle stared at her. Lila said it again. Hannah moved. For the next 36 hours, Lila did not sleep. She wrung cold water out of cloths and laid them across the boy's forehead, his neck, his wrists. She made a thin tea of willow bark and honey. She fed it to him 1 spoon at a time between teeth that had to be coaxed open. She put mustard poultices on his small chest to bring up the cough. She propped him up so he would not drown in his own lungs. She held his hand while he shook. She wiped his face when he cried. She did not pray out loud because she had not prayed in years, but she said his name, Caleb. She said it like a thread she was pulling him along. Holden split wood for the stove. He carried water. He stood in the kitchen doorway with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and watched her work, and at some point in the middle of the second night, he stopped seeing the woman from the pole and started seeing the woman in front of him. A teacher, a nurse, a woman with the kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with what she had survived, the kind that had everything to do with who she had decided to be in spite of it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Caleb Doyle opened his eyes. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked at his mother. He said, "I want toast." Hannah Doyle fell to her knees by the bed and pressed her forehead to her son's small hand. Eli Doyle stood in the doorway and wept without making a sound. Lila Whitmore went out onto the porch. She sat down on the top step. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She did not have any cry left. Holden came out a minute later. He sat down beside her, not touching, just beside. After a long time, he said, "Ma'am." "Lila." "Lottie." He stopped. He swallowed. "Lottie," he said. "The doctor wouldn't come up the mountain. He was scared. The fever was in town, too. He sent a boy with a bottle of something and a note. The note said dose her every 4 hours. I dosed her every 4 hours. I dosed her for 2 days. I did everything in the note." "I know," she whispered. I think now of if somebody who knew about children." He could not finish. He did not have to. She did not turn her face to him. She just slid her hand just slightly across the cold porch boards until the side of her hand touched the side of his. That was all. They did not move. The wind had died. The sky had gone soft. A small bird somewhere in the pines was making its first careful sound of the morning. The Doyles came up the mountain themselves a week later, with 3 other families. They came in 2 wagons. They brought a sack of dried beans. They brought a jar of put-up beans. They brought a bolt of plain blue cloth. They brought a tin pail of new churned butter. They brought a small handmade rag doll that the Doyle's eldest daughter had stayed up the night before sewing because she had heard her father say that the woman who had saved her brother had sat in a child's bedroom in a torn dress with no things of her own. The rag doll had a face stitched in black thread. The face was smiling. Lila stood on the porch and could not speak. Hannah Doyle handed her the doll. Hannah Doyle said very quietly, "Whatever they said about you in town, we do not believe it, and we will say so anywhere it needs saying." Lila held the doll the way you hold a baby bird. She nodded. She could not do more than nod. That afternoon, she sat on the porch with the doll on her lap. The dog lay at her feet. Holden was in the yard repairing the same porch step he had been repairing the day she first hummed in his kitchen. He had been repairing it on and off for 2 weeks. He kept finding new things wrong with it. She watched him work. She thought, he is afraid to finish it. Because if he finishes it, the porch will be done, and then he will have to think about what to fix next, and he is not ready to choose. She did not know yet that the next thing he was going to fix was himself. The next morning, the visitor came that nobody had been expecting. It was Mrs. Mabel Hayes. She came up the mountain in Boyd Crenshaw's supply wagon. The same Boyd Crenshaw who had sat on a crate at the foot of the pole in the marketplace and let a woman freeze for 2 days because Thaddeus Pell held a piece of paper on his sister's land. Tobias was the first to spot the wagon. He came in from the south meadow at a long lope. "Wagon coming up, Crenshaw's. Old woman in the seat." Holden looked up from the porch step. "Hayes?" "Looks like it." Holden glanced at Lila. He did not say anything, but his jaw had gone tight in a way she had come to read. She came out onto the porch. She watched the wagon climb the last rise. She thought very calmly, "I am not afraid of Boyd Crenshaw. I am not afraid of any one man anymore. I am only afraid of what they have come up the mountain to tell me." Boyd brought the wagon to a stop at the foot of the steps. He did not get down right away. He took his hat off his head. He held it in his lap. He did not look at Lila. Mrs. Mabel Hayes climbed down by herself. She was a small woman, late 60s, iron gray hair, a black dress under a heavy gray shawl. She had eyes that had seen too much and had decided a long time ago not to look away from any of it. She walked to the bottom of the steps. She looked up at Lila. She said, "Child, I have been trying to come up this mountain for 10 days. The weather wouldn't let me. And she tilted her head dryly at Boyd Crenshaw in the wagon. "And he has been trying to find the courage to drive me." Boyd Crenshaw stared down at his hat. Mrs. Hayes turned back to Lila. "My name is Mabel Hayes. I remember you. You remember a biscuit, dear. I remember a kindness." Mrs. Hayes's eyes filled, briefly. She did not let them spill. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I have something to tell all three of you, and what I have to tell you I have been carrying for 2 years, and it is heavier than I thought I could carry up a mountain. But here I am." She took one step. Holden very slowly came down from the porch. He offered her his arm. Mrs. Mabel Hayes, 67 years old, looked up at the giant of a man who had cut a chain off a girl in the middle of a marketplace, and she put her small, bony hand on his forearm as if she had been waiting her whole life for him to offer it. He walked her up the steps. Lila held the door open. Behind them, Boyd Crenshaw climbed down from the wagon at last. He stood at the foot of the porch steps. He did not come up. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked out across the snow at the pine tree at the back of the yard, as if he knew somehow that there were rifles in it. "Mr. Briggs," he said. Holden paused in the doorway. "What?" "I have been a coward." A pause. "I have been a coward for 5 years." Holden did not answer. "I have something to give you. When the lady is done speaking, I have a book, a ledger, with names and dates. And Boyd Crenshaw stopped. His voice had broken. "I will go to hell for what I let happen. I know that. But I will not go quietly. I will not let it stay buried." He looked up. His face was older than Lila had remembered. His eyes were wet. There were 6 women, he said. Before her, there were 6. The wind moved the snow on the porch rail. Inside the house, Mrs. Mabel Hayes was sitting down at the kitchen table. She was lifting a small velvet pouch out of her shawl. She was setting it carefully on the wood. Whatever was in the pouch, it was going to change everything. Lila stood with one hand on the doorframe. She looked back once down the slope of the mountain where the road wound away through the pines toward Silver Pine Hollow. Toward the valley, toward the Pell Ranch, she thought. He is coming. She did not know how she knew, but she knew. And the strange thing was that this time, she was not standing on a marketplace floor. She was standing in a doorway of a house that, for the first time in 3 winters, had remembered how to breathe. Mrs. Mabel Hayes sat at the kitchen table. She set the small velvet pouch on the wood between them. She looked at it for a long count before she could look up. My niece, she said, Adelaide. She came west in the spring of '73. She was 21 years old. Her father had died of a lung complaint. Her mother could not feed all 6 of them. So Adelaide answered an advertisement in a St. Louis paper from a Montana cattleman of good Christian character. Lila's hand went to her own throat, the cameo that was no longer there. Mrs. Hayes saw the gesture. She nodded. His name was Mr. Pell in the letters. Royce. Mrs. Hayes folded her hands on the table. She wrote to me twice. The first letter said the man was kind. The second letter said the man was not the man in the letters. The third letter never came. That was August of '73, 2 years and 3 months ago. Lila sat down across from her, carefully, as if the chair might give. Holden stood at the stove. He did not move. He did not interrupt. He had the patience of a man who knew when to keep quiet for a woman who had been waiting 2 years to speak. Tobias stood by the door. He did not move either. Mrs. Hayes opened the pouch. Inside was a small gold locket, the kind a girl wears to her first communion. It had been crushed on one side, as if a boot had stepped on it. They sent this back to her mother, Mrs. Hayes said, along with a letter from the sheriff in Silver Pine Hollow, saying Adelaide had run off with a freight driver to San Francisco. The locket, they said, had been found by the road. She closed her hand around the locket. Adelaide did not run off. No, Lila whispered. Adelaide is buried somewhere on the Pell Range, and I have spent 2 years trying to find a man brave enough to help me prove it, and every man I asked was either on the Pell payroll or scared of being put on the Pell payroll, until you, Mr. Crenshaw. She did not turn her head. She knew Boyd was now standing in the doorway behind her with his hat in his hands. Mr. Crenshaw came to my parlor in September. He said he had been keeping a book. He said he could not look at himself in his shaving mirror anymore. He said his sister had been threatened. He said his nephew had been threatened. He said he wanted out, and he did not know how. I told him there is only one way out, and that is forward, through the door, into the daylight, carrying every name. Mrs. Hayes opened her hand again. She slid the locket across the table to Lila. There are 6 names, child. 6. Adelaide and 5 others. 2 from St. Louis, 1 from Chicago, 1 from Pittsburgh, 1 from a settlement in Iowa. We do not yet know if any of them are still alive. We suspect not, but we know the names because Mr. Crenshaw kept the freight records of every box, every trunk, every traveling case that came in on the stage with a young woman attached to it and never left. Lila picked up the locket. It was warm. She did not know why it was warm. It had been in a pouch against an old woman's chest, up a mountain, in a wagon, in November. It was warm. She closed her hand around it. She closed her eyes. She said very quietly, I should have died on the floor of his stable. Holden moved, just 1 step. Mrs. Hayes lifted her chin. No, Mrs. Hayes said, sharp, iron clear. No, you should not have. Because if you had died on that floor, child, none of us would know what we know. You are the witness. You are the one who saw it and walked. You are the reason we can break this open." Lila opened her eyes. She looked at the old woman across the table. She thought, "I came west on a lie, to a man who wanted to harm me. I lost everything I owned. I lost my name. I lost my dignity. I lost my hope, and I lost it twice, and the second time hurt worse than the first. But, but maybe, just maybe, losing all of it was the price of being the one woman who got out alive carrying the truth." She set the locket down on the table. She set her hand on top of it. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Mrs. Hayes smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a soldier's smile. "For now," she said, "you stay alive. You let Mr. Crenshaw ride for the United States Marshal's office in Helena, by the side trail, not by the road, because the wires can be cut. A man on a horse with a letter in his pocket cannot. You let the law come up the mountain to you, and you let the men who came up the mountain for the wrong reasons find that you are no longer the one they expected." Boyd Crenshaw in the doorway was crying without sound. He held out the leather-bound ledger he had been carrying under his coat. Holden walked over. He took it. He did not open it. He set it on the mantel above the cold parlor fireplace, the way you set a relic on an altar. Boyd Crenshaw rode out an hour later. He took the spare mare from the Briggs corral. He took the side trail down through the timber, the one the Pell men did not know about. He took a folded paper in his coat pocket that Mrs. Mabel Hayes had written in her own careful schoolteacher's hand, to the United States Marshal Helena, Montana Territory. He looked back one time before the trees took him. Lila stood on the porch. She raised one hand to him. He raised his hat to her in return. Neither of them needed to say anything. Mrs. Hayes stayed. She did not ask. She just stayed. She helped Lila put on a kettle. She sat at the kitchen table and she peeled potatoes with her arthritic hands as if she had been peeling potatoes in this kitchen her whole life. By dusk, the snow had thickened again. Tobias was on the roof of the barn with the brass spyglass. He came down at a run. He came in through the kitchen door without stamping the snow off his boots, which he had never done in his life. "6 riders," he said. "South Ridge, coming up the main road." Holden was already moving. He went to the pine tree. He came back with the rifles. He came back with the cartridges. He came back with the canvas roll of money, which he handed to Mrs. Hayes without explanation. She took it. She put it inside her shawl. She did not ask. Lila stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hands at her sides. She thought, "This is the part where I am supposed to be afraid." She waited for the fear. It did not come. What came instead was a kind of stillness she had not felt before, the way a deep pool of water is still, heavy, cold, patient. She walked to the front hall. She opened the drawer. She took out the Colt pocket. She checked the cylinder the way Tobias had taught her. She slid it into the pocket of her apron. She walked back to the kitchen. Holden looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "I am not hiding in a cellar this time." He said, "I never asked you to." Tobias barred the front door. He barred the back door. He pulled the curtains across the parlor windows. He set the sharps on the windowsill above the sink with the barrel resting on a folded dish towel. He put Mrs. Hayes in the cellar with the dog. Mrs. Hayes did not argue. She knew where she was useful and where she was not. She took the dog under one arm. She took a lantern in the other. She took a Bible Lila handed her without being asked. She went down the cellar steps with the dignity of a woman walking down the aisle of a church. The dog whimpered once at the top of the stairs, looking back at Lila. "Go on," Lila said softly. "Go on, friend. I will see you in the morning." She closed the cellar door. She did not let herself think about whether that was a promise she could keep. The first shot came at full dark. It came through the kitchen window above the sink. The glass came apart in a single sheet that fell like a drop sheet of ice. Tobias did not flinch. He had been waiting for it. He squeezed the trigger of the sharps. He squeezed it the way he had told Lila to squeeze. Slow. Trust the front sight. The back sight is a liar. Somewhere out in the snow, a man cried out and went down. The first Pell rider was gone. Lila pressed her back against the kitchen wall. She had the Colt pocket in both hands. She held it pointed at the floor the way she had been taught, because a gun pointed at the floor cannot accidentally kill a man you love. A voice came from the dark yard, a young voice, calm, pleasant. "Miss Whitmore." She closed her eyes. Royce Pell. "Miss Whitmore, I have come a long way to bring you home." She did not answer. "Miss Whitmore, my father is with me, and 4 of his men, and I have to tell you, sweet girl, that the men I have brought are not my father's nicest men." She did not answer. "Miss Whitmore, the Briggs brothers cannot fight all of us forever. Walk out, sweet girl. Walk out and no one else has to die. The big one, the tall one with the dead wife. He has been hospitable, but hospitality costs." She opened her eyes. She looked across the kitchen at Holden. He had taken the Henry rifle off the wall by the parlor door. He had levered around into the chamber. He was watching her. He was not telling her what to do. He was waiting to see what she chose. She thought, "He cut my chain and asked nothing in return. He set me at his table. He gave me a child's room. He put a gun in my hand and taught me with patience I did not earn. He has waited 2 weeks to put his hand on mine for the length of one breath on a porch. He is right now leaving me the room to choose." She had not been left the room to choose in a very long time. She did choose. She raised her chin. She called back. Her voice came clear and steady through the broken window. "Royce Pell, there is no sweet girl here. There is only a witness, and the United States Marshal is on his way." A long silence, then a laugh, Royce's laugh. Royce's, the same laugh he had laughed on the porch of his ranch the morning he had handed her a coffee cup and called her his. "Sweetheart, there is no marshal coming. The wires went down in the storm. I cut them myself." She felt the cold come into her stomach. She kept her face still, because she remembered. Boyd had not gone for the telegraph wires. Boyd had gone for the marshals directly, with a written letter. By the side trail, 40 miles overland, not by the road that had wires. Royce had cut the wrong line. She did not say that. She said instead, "Then I will wait." A different voice answered her this time. Older, slower, the voice of a man who had not been crossed in 20 years. Thaddeus Pell. "Girl." She closed her hand on the Colt. "Girl, you walk out, or my boys burn the house, with the brothers in it, and the old woman in the cellar, whose name I know." Lila's eyes moved to the cellar door. "Mrs. Hayes." She thought very fast. She thought, "I cannot let them burn this house. I cannot let them put a torch to the bedroom upstairs where a child's ribbon still hangs on a bedpost. I cannot let them put a torch to the rocking chair Mary Briggs used to sit in. I cannot let them touch a single board of this porch where a man knelt down to repair a step over and over because he was learning to be alive again. I cannot, but also I am not walking out that door because that is what they want. And the one thing I have learned in Boston, in the stagecoach, in the Pell House, at the pole, in this kitchen, is that I do not have to give them what they want anymore." Tobias squeezed off another shot. Out in the dark, a horse screamed and went down. A man cursed. Something heavy fell off the rear of a saddle. 2. Holden moved to the parlor window. He cracked the curtain. He fired. The Henry sang. Another curse from the yard. 3. Lila looked at the back door. The back door was barred. The cellar hatch was in the pantry, behind a shelf of preserves. She thought, if one of them comes around back. The pantry door is closest to the back door. The pantry door is the door into Mrs. Hayes, into the dog, into the only piece of this house that has no rifle waiting for it. That is the door I will hold. She crossed the kitchen on quiet feet. She did not say anything to Holden. He saw her go. He understood. He nodded once. He went back to the window. She slipped into the pantry. She closed the door behind her. She turned the small wooden latch. She stood with her back to the closed door and her Colt in both hands. She heard the back door of the kitchen. She heard it. Slowly. Test. Push. Test again. A man's shoulder. pushing, carefully, checking the bar. Then, footsteps moving on, around the corner of the house. She thought, he is going for the cellar window. The cellar had a small window at the back. It was sized for ventilation, not for a man, but Royce Pell was a slim man. Royce Pell could fit. She heard glass break, small glass, far below her, through the floorboards. She heard Mrs. Hayes gasp once. The dog let out a low, warning growl. She unlatched the pantry door. She pulled the shelf of preserves aside on its hinge. She opened the cellar hatch. She went down the steps with the Colt up. She did not run. Running on cellar steps in the dark was how people died. She came down into the lantern light. Mrs. Hayes was pressed against the far wall with the Bible held up like a shield. The dog was standing in front of her with its hackles up. And in the broken window, coming through head first, Royce Pell. She had time. She had time in that moment while his hands were finding the floor and his shoulders were sliding through the small window to do anything at all. She could shoot him. In the head. It would be easy. He was almost upside down. She had been practicing. She had been practicing on a fence post, but she had been practicing on a fence post that in her head had Royce Pell's face on it. And she had not told anyone that, but it was true. She raised the Colt. She put the front sight on his temple. He dropped to the cellar floor. He turned. He saw her. He smiled. He smiled the way he had smiled on the porch. He raised his own hands. He was holding a long-bladed knife. He had not drawn his pistol. He had wanted the knife. Because Royce Pell, she understood in that moment with a clarity that did not even feel angry, had wanted to do it close. Wanted to feel it. She had time. She had so much time. She thought, I can pull this trigger. I can put a hole in his head. I can end him. I can end every other woman's chance of standing in their own cellar with their own Colt and their own ghost of him. I can do that, and Holden will not blame me, and Mrs. Hayes will not blame me, and the United States Marshal will not blame me. I will be the woman who shot the snake. The town will write a song about me. But Royce dead is one snake. Royce alive is 6 women. Royce alive is Adelaide Hayes's grave, pointed to by Royce Pell's own finger, on Royce Pell's own map, in Royce Pell's own confession, in a Helena courthouse, in front of the United States Marshal. Royce alive is the 4 ones from St. Louis and Chicago and Pittsburgh and Iowa, whose mothers are still waiting for letters that will never come. Royce dead is one snake. Royce alive is 6 funerals. She lowered the Colt. Just a little. She fired. The shot took him in the right shoulder. His arm dropped. The knife fell. He screamed. She had never made another person scream before in her life, and she felt the scream in her own teeth, and she did not flinch. He went down to his knees. He looked up at her. He was no longer smiling. You, he gasped. You missed. She walked across the cellar floor. The dog moved aside for her. She put the muzzle of the Colt against the center of his forehead, lightly, so he could feel that it was there, so he could feel that she could choose, so he could feel which one of them in this moment was deciding. No, Royce, she said, quietly, almost gently. I did not miss. His face went the color of old paper. You are going to live, Royce. You are going to live, and you are going to talk. You are going to tell a federal judge in Helena where you put Adelaide Hayes. You are going to say her name in a courtroom. You are going to say 5 other names. And you are going to do it because the only thing left between you and a rope is whatever you can say that is true. You wanted me to be the kind of woman who killed you, so you could be a dead boy in his father's story instead of a coward in a federal cell. I am not that woman. I will not become that woman for you. She took a step back. She kept the Colt on him. Hands behind your back, Royce. He hesitated. The dog growled low. Hands behind your back. He put his hands behind his back. His right arm shook with the pain. He whimpered once. She felt nothing about it. Mrs. Hayes, somewhere behind her, already had a length of clothesline in her hands. Mrs. Hayes was already moving forward to tie him. Above them in the kitchen came the boom of the Henry rifle, and then a shotgun blast from the porch. And then after that, silence. Lila stood in the cellar with her Colt on a kneeling man. Mrs. Hayes knotted the clothesline with quick, practiced hands. The dog sat down on the cold cellar floor and looked up at Lila as if to say, "I told you. I told you the first day. You were going to be all right." Footsteps on the kitchen floor above, then on the cellar stairs. Then Holden was in the lantern light. He had blood on his sleeve. It was not his. His eyes went to her. They went to the Colt. They went to Royce on his knees, tied at the wrists, his shoulder bleeding through his fine coat. Holden looked at her face. He did not ask if she was all right. He saw that she was. He just stood there for a moment. Then he holstered the revolver in his belt. He came across the floor. He took the Colt out of her hand. Gently. He set it down on a barrel. He took her two hands in his. He turned them over. He looked at them as if he were checking for cuts. There were no cuts. He drew her one slow step against his chest. He did not embrace her. He just let her forehead rest against the front of his coat. She let it. Above them in the dark, Tobias's voice called down through the floorboards. "All out, brother. 4 down. 1 run for the timber. Thaddeus." Holden lifted his head. "Tobias." "I followed him through the south fence. He pulled on me. He didn't make it." A long silence. Then Tobias added quieter, "The old man won't be giving any more orders." Holden closed his eyes. He pressed his cheek for one moment to the top of Lila's head. Outside, somewhere in the long miles between the Briggs Ranch and Helena, a man named Boyd Crenshaw was still riding. He would not see Helena until the next afternoon. He would reach the lit windows of the marshal's office at dusk, with a letter in his coat pocket and a name on his lips that by the end of that week would be telegraphed to every newspaper from Helena to Boston. The United States Marshals came up the mountain 2 days later. 8 of them. They came with a federal judge. They came with 2 reporters from the Helena Herald. They came with a wagon for prisoners. They came with a coroner's box for Thaddeus Pell. They took Royce Pell. Royce Pell talked. He talked all the way to Helena. He talked at the federal courthouse in February. He talked under oath. He named places. He drew maps. The marshals found Adelaide Hayes's grave in March in a meadow above a creek on Pell land. They found 3 of the others by May. The last 2 were never found. Their families were sent the names of where the searches had been and a small bag of earth from the meadow and a stone with the date carved on it. Royce Pell was sentenced to life at the Montana Territorial Prison in Deer Lodge. The judge spared him the rope for one reason only: the testimony. He died in a cell 6 years later, stabbed by another prisoner over a stolen tobacco pouch. He was 29. Lila Whitmore would not learn of his death until the next spring, when a newspaper clipping arrived in the mail from a stranger in Helena. She would read it. She would set it down. She would walk out to the pine tree at the back of the yard. She would stand there for a long time. She would not cry. She would not smile. She would simply stand. And then she would walk back inside and put the kettle on. That, however, was years ahead. The morning after the long night, Lila stood on the porch with a tin cup of coffee in her hand. The marshals were gone. The wagon was gone. The reporters were gone. Mrs. Mabel Hayes was in the kitchen humming. Tobias was rubbing down the buckskin. The dog was sitting on the porch step beside her with its torn ear cocked at the bright cold air. Holden came up beside her. His arm was bandaged. He stood there with her in silence for a long count. Then he said very low, "Stay." She did not turn. She kept looking out at the snow and the line of pines and the long road that somewhere ran down to a town that no longer had a pole in it because the people of Silver Pine Hollow had taken it down themselves the morning after the marshals left without anyone telling them to. "Stay," he said again. "Not because you have nowhere to go. Stay because for 3 winters this house forgot how to breathe, and now it remembers. And I do not want to walk back into a house that has forgotten again." She did turn now. She looked up at him. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I have never had a home. I do not know how to have one. I will get it wrong. I'll get it wrong with you. You will be patient. I will, even when I cannot bear to be touched. Especially then. even when I weep over a child's ribbon for no reason. There is a reason. She nodded. She set the coffee cup on the rail. She put both her hands very lightly on the front of his coat. He covered them with one of his. That was all. The kiss came in the spring, under the same pine tree, without ceremony. It tasted like coffee and cold air and the small wild mint that grew at the base of the trunk. It lasted the length of one slow breath. It was the first kiss either of them had given to a living person in more than 3 years. Neither of them said anything after it. There was nothing to say. The wedding was small. It was held in the meadow above the ranch in late May when the wildflowers had come back. Blue lupine, Indian paintbrush, the first wild roses. Lila wore a plain blue dress that Hannah Doyle had sewn for her on a borrowed Singer machine. Mrs. Mabel Hayes pinned a small spray of forget-me-nots to her hair. Tobias walked her across the meadow with his arm hooked through hers, which had taken her by surprise, and which she had not let him see her cry about. Boyd Crenshaw brought the rings. He had ridden up from town with them in a small wooden box. He set the box on the porch rail and then stepped back without a word, because Boyd Crenshaw had decided that whole winter that he was a man who would never again be in the center of anybody's picture. He would carry the rings. He would hold the horses. He would dig the graves when graves were needed. He would not stand at the front again. The Doyles came. The 4 families who had brought butter and beans came. Mrs. Mabel Hayes officiated because the circuit preacher had declined, and Mrs. Mabel Hayes had taken one look at the circuit preacher's note declining and said dryly, "Then I will do it myself. God has had a long talk with me about this, and he has agreed." Lila and Holden said their vows under a sky the color of a robin's egg. They did not promise to obey. They promised to keep breathing in the same house. Tobias caught the bouquet, which had not actually been thrown, because Lila walked over and put it directly into his hands. And Tobias looked at it and then looked across the meadow at Florence Crenshaw, who had come up the mountain with her brother that morning, and who was standing beside the porch in a yellow dress holding a pie. And Florence looked back at Tobias, and Tobias turned a color that on him was nearly red. That was the spring of 1876, the first year. By the autumn of 1877, Lila had opened a small school in Silver Pine Hollow. It was held in the back room of Mrs. Mabel Hayes's parlor. There were 11 students. Caleb Doyle was one of them. He brought her a wildflower every Monday for 2 years. He never told her why, and she never asked because she knew. By the spring of 1878, Lila and Mrs. Hayes had founded the Adelaide Aid Society. It was a small thing at first, a room above the dry goods store, a box of donated clothes, a list of safe houses across the territory. Within 5 years, it had chapters in Helena, Bozeman, Missoula, and Butte. Within 10, it was helping women across 3 states. They never charged a penny. They were funded at first by the canvas roll of money Mrs. Hayes had quietly carried out of a hollow pine tree on a November night, which had turned out to be a great deal more money than any of them had realized, because Tobias Briggs had been saving for a war for a long time. By the summer of 1879, Lila and Holden had a baby. It was a girl. She had her mother's cornflower blue eyes. She had her father's dark hair. She had a smile that came easy and stayed long. They named her Lottie. Holden held her for the first time in the upstairs bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed. He did not cry because Holden Briggs did not cry, but he held the baby for a long time without speaking. And when he finally looked up at Lila, his eyes were wet. And that was a thing she had never seen and would only see a few more times in the rest of their life. He said, "I was scared." She said, "I know." He said, "I was scared that the name would hurt." She said, "It does not hurt. Some things you name in memory, some things you name in joy. This one is in joy." He nodded. He looked back down at the baby. The new Lottie wrapped her small fist around his thick-scarred finger. He stayed that way for an hour. Tobias married Florence Crenshaw in the autumn of 1886. They built a smaller cabin on the south slope. They had 3 boys, all of whom turned out tall and thin and quiet like their father, and all of whom learned to bake pie crust from their mother, who was sharp-tongued and warm-hearted, and never let anyone forget for a single day that Boyd Crenshaw was her brother, and that she loved him, and that the past was something you carried, not something you were. Boyd Crenshaw lived until 1894. He never married. He served 4 terms as the elected sheriff of Silver Pine Hollow, replacing the man who had let a woman freeze at a pole. He was buried in the town cemetery under a stone that said only he told the truth at last. Mrs. Mabel Hayes lived until 1899. She wore black on the anniversary of Adelaide's death every March, and she wore white on the anniversary of Adelaide's funeral every May, because she said grief was a long marriage and a marriage needed 2 colors. By 1901, Lila Whitmore Briggs was 48 years old. She stood on the porch of the ranch house on a summer afternoon. The porch step had long since been finished, then refinished, then rebuilt, then refinished again. There were new chairs on it. There was a small loom in the corner where Lila wove on rainy days. There was a small wooden box of toys at the foot of the railing that belonged to grandchildren. 4 of them, now 3 from the new Lottie, who had married a quiet young veterinarian named Samuel from Bozeman, and 1 from Lottie's younger brother, Eli, named for the man who had ridden up the mountain alone in a blizzard to fetch help for a sick boy. Holden was 61. He had silver at his temples and silver in his beard, and a slight stiffness in his left knee from an old hay-falling incident she had bandaged with her own hands. He had grown somehow even quieter as he aged. But he laughed now, out loud, especially when the children were on the porch. The hook-shaped scar at the corner of his mouth was a smile line now. It had finally found its purpose. He came up the porch steps. He had been mending fence. He had a coil of wire over one shoulder. He set it down. He took off his hat. He sat down on the chair beside her. She handed him her tin coffee cup. He took it. He took one swallow. He handed it back. They sat for a long time without speaking. At the edge of the property, just inside the fence line, stood a tall cottonwood pole. It was the same pole. He had bought it from the town 12 years before, after the new courthouse went up and the old marketplace was being torn out for a feed store. He had hauled it up the mountain on a flatbed wagon. He had sunk it deep into the earth by himself in a single November afternoon. At the foot of the pole was a flat brass plate. Engraved on it were 7 names: Adelaide Hayes, and 5 other names from St. Louis, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Iowa, and a town no one had ever heard of called Cooper's Mill. The 7th name was Mary Briggs, because Lila had asked. Because Lila had said gently that grief was not a contest, and that a woman who had died because a doctor was too afraid to come up a mountain deserved a name on the same plate as women who had died because cruel men had walked up another one. Holden had not been able to speak for a long time after she had asked. Then he had simply nodded. And so Mary's name was there too. "We do not forget the plate," said under the 7 names, "and we do not go back." A small girl with cornflower blue eyes came up the porch steps. She was maybe 4. She had a wildflower in her fat little fist. She held it up to Lila with absolute solemnity. "Graham," she said. Baby. For the lady." "Which lady?" "The one in the post." Lila looked at Holden. Holden looked back at her. The little girl was talking about the brass plate. To her child's understanding, the names on the brass plate were a lady who lived in the pole. The lady who had once been lonely. The lady who Graham and Grandpa visited sometimes in the cool of the evening. Lila bent down. She took the wildflower. She kissed the small fist that had held it. "She will love it, baby." The child ran off to chase a butterfly across the yard. The dog, much older now, white at the muzzle, lifted its head from where it lay in the sun, considered the chase, decided against it, laid its head back down. Holden took Lila's hand. She let him. They walked together slowly across the yard, past the rose bushes Tobias's wife Florence had planted by the path, past the old pine tree at the back of the yard which no longer had anything hidden in its base, because the canvas roll of money had long since been spent on a school and aid society. 4 chapters across 2 states, in a small library above the dry goods store where any woman ever could come in and sit down and be safe. They stopped at the foot of the pole. The little girl came back panting, the butterfly forgotten. Lila knelt down. She took the wildflower from her small granddaughter's hand. She tucked it gently into the joint where the brass plate met the wood. She put her hand on the pole. For one breath, she closed her eyes. She said only to herself, only to a young woman who had stood at the same pole, On a November afternoon a quarter century ago, with her wrists rubbed raw and a sign hung around her neck and 3 crumbs of bread in her pocket for a hungry dog, she said, "Look at us, friend. Look what we became." She opened her eyes. She straightened up. Holden offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back to the porch in the long gold light. The dog watched them come. The grandchild ran ahead. The kettle was on. Tobias and Florence were riding up the road from their cabin for supper. Mrs. Mabel Hayes had been dead 2 years, and her photograph on the mantel still looked at the kitchen the way she had looked at it in life. Approving, iron clear. Lila stopped just once at the top of the porch steps. She looked back. The pole stood there in the sun. The plate caught the light. She said quietly to the man whose arm she was holding, "The day you cut my chain." He waited. That was the day. She paused. She put her free hand on his chest over his heart, and she left it there. That was the day I started to live. He covered her hand with his. He did not answer with words. He never had. He drew her gently across the porch and through the open door of the house that had for the last quarter century never once forgotten how to breathe. Inside, the kettle began to sing.